They were born into palaces of silk and gold, the sons and daughters of Edward IV, the handsome Yorkist king who won a crown through war and charm. But in a single generation, the dynasty that once ruled England's greatest castles scattered into monasteries, marriage alliances, and mystery. One daughter became mother to the Tudors. 2 sons vanished inside the tower. Others found quiet lives far from the throne their father fought for. Today we follow each of Edward IV's children, princes, princesses, and the one acknowledged illegitimate son, to trace what became of them after the Wars of the Roses ended. From Elizabeth, who bridged York and Lancaster through marriage, to little Bridget, who chose God over earthly power, their stories reveal how a royal bloodline dissolves and transforms across generations. In February 1466, Westminster Palace welcomed its first Yorkist princess. Elizabeth of York arrived as her father, Edward IV, was consolidating his victory over the Lancastrians, making her birth a symbol of dynastic hope. As the eldest child, she carried the weight of future alliances from her earliest days. Her mother, Elizabeth Woodville, had already proven controversial, a commoner widow who'd captured the king's heart and disrupted planned foreign marriages. But their daughter would vindicate that choice, becoming perhaps the most consequential of all Edward's children. Elizabeth grew up in the refined court of Edward IV, learning French, Latin, and the delicate arts of diplomacy. Her childhood was punctuated by her father's brief exile in 1470, when she fled to sanctuary at Westminster Abbey with her mother. This early taste of political uncertainty shaped her understanding that royal privilege could vanish overnight. When Edward regained his throne in 1471, Elizabeth resumed her position as England's premier princess. She watched her younger siblings arrive, Mary, Cecily, the precious heir Edward, and understood her role as eldest daughter in the complex choreography of royal marriages. Elizabeth's hand became Edward IV's most valuable diplomatic tool. At various times she was promised to the Dauphin of France, then to the Duke of Burgundy's heir. Each negotiation fell through as European politics shifted, leaving Elizabeth in the peculiar position of being simultaneously the most eligible and most elusive bride in Christendom. The death of her father in April 1483 changed everything. As her uncle Richard III moved to claim the throne, Elizabeth found herself stripped of legitimacy, declared a bastard alongside her siblings through Parliament's Act. Her brothers vanished into the Tower, and she faced an uncertain future as a former princess without status or protection. From sanctuary at Westminster, Elizabeth watched Henry Tudor's invasion take shape. The Lancastrian claimant's mother, Margaret Beaufort, had identified Elizabeth as the key to uniting the warring houses. A marriage between Henry and Elizabeth would symbolically heal the wounds of the Wars of the Roses. On Christmas Day, 1483, Henry Tudor publicly vowed to marry Elizabeth if he won the crown. This pledge transformed her from political liability to political necessity, the York princess whose womb could legitimize Tudor rule. Henry's victory at Bosworth Field in August 1485 sealed Elizabeth's fate. She married the new king in January 1486, becoming Queen of England before her 20th birthday. Their union represented more than romance. It was a calculated healing of national trauma. Elizabeth bore Henry 8 children, though only 4 survived to adulthood. Her eldest son Arthur embodied their dynastic hopes, named for the legendary king to emphasize the Tudors' supposed ancient British heritage. When Arthur died young, her second son Henry became heir, the future Henry VIII. As queen, Elizabeth walked a careful line between honoring her York heritage and supporting her Tudor husband. She maintained relationships with surviving York loyalists while never challenging Henry's authority. This diplomatic skill served her well through rebellions led by Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck, both claiming to be her supposedly dead brothers. The death of her eldest son Arthur in 1502 devastated Elizabeth. When her daughter Catherine of Aragon became a widow at 16, Elizabeth understood the fragility of dynastic plans. Her own death in February 1503, just days after giving birth to a daughter who also died, ended the first generation of Tudor rule. Through Elizabeth, Edward IV's blood entered the Tudor line permanently. Her son, Henry VIII, granddaughter Mary I, and great-granddaughter Elizabeth I all carried York genetics alongside Tudor ambition. The White Rose of York lived on in the royal arms, symbolically united with the Red Rose of Lancaster. More subtly, Elizabeth's descendants inherited her gift for political survival. The Tudor talent for adapting to changing circumstances echoed her own journey from York princess to Tudor queen. Her legacy proved that sometimes the greatest power lies not in ruling, but in bridging the gap between one dynasty and the next. While Elizabeth's star rose with the Tudors, her younger sister Mary's story ended in tragedy. Born in August 1467, Mary of York entered the world during her father's secure reign when the future seemed bright for York princesses. As the second daughter, Mary occupied a different position from Elizabeth. Where her elder sister bore the weight of diplomatic marriages, Mary enjoyed a relatively carefree childhood in the royal nursery, playing with her growing collection of siblings. Mary shared tutors with Elizabeth, learning the languages and graces expected of royal daughters. Contemporary accounts describe her as lively and intelligent, quick to master her lessons in French and Latin. She particularly excelled at music, a talent encouraged in Edward IV's artistic court. The family's flight to sanctuary in 1470, affected Mary deeply. At 3 years old, she was old enough to sense the fear, but too young to understand its cause. This early exposure to political instability may have contributed to the anxiety that would mark her short life. By 1481, Mary had been tentatively promised to Frederick, the future King of Denmark. This alliance would have strengthened England's position in northern European politics while providing Mary with a crown of her own. Negotiations proceeded slowly, delayed by diplomatic complexities and the bride's young age. Mary showed enthusiasm for her potential marriage, reportedly learning Danish phrases and studying maps of her future kingdom. Her father encouraged these preparations, seeing in Mary a chance to place York influence on another European throne. In May 1482, at just 14 years old, Mary died suddenly at Greenwich Palace. Contemporary sources give no clear cause, suggesting either illness or possibly complications from early pregnancy, though she was unmarried. Her death shocked the court and devastated her parents. Edward IV's grief at losing Mary was reportedly profound. He had seen in her a tool for Danish alliance and a daughter who might enjoy the queenly status that political reality might deny Elizabeth. Her funeral at Westminster was magnificent, befitting a princess whose potential would never be realized. Mary's death eliminated one potential avenue for York bloodline continuation. Had she lived to marry Frederick and bear children, the houses of York and Denmark might have formed lasting bonds. Instead, her brief life serves as a reminder of how quickly royal plans could collapse through mortality's intervention. In March 1469, a third York princess entered the world named Cecily for her formidable grandmother, Cecily Neville, the Rose of Raby. This naming choice revealed Edward IV's respect for his mother, whose political acumen had helped secure his throne. Born during a period of renewed York stability, Cecily enjoyed early years free from the upheavals that had marked her elder sister's childhoods. Her birth coincided with her father's efforts to establish lasting peace with former Lancastrian territories. Cecily shared the refined education provided to all Edward's daughters. She proved particularly adept at languages, eventually speaking French, Latin, and some German fluently. Her musical abilities exceeded even Mary's, and she composed several pieces that survive in manuscript form. Unlike Elizabeth, who bore the weight of being heir presumptive to diplomatic marriages, Cecily enjoyed relative freedom in her early teens. This allowed her to develop intellectual interests beyond the typical royal curriculum, including mathematics and natural philosophy. When Henry Tudor claimed the throne, Cecily faced the same legitimacy crisis as her siblings. However, her marriage prospects actually improved under Tudor rule. In late 1487, she married John Wells, Viscount Wells, a Lancastrian nobleman who had supported Henry VII's invasion. This marriage served Tudor interests perfectly. By wedding Cecily to a trusted supporter, Henry neutralized potential York claims while rewarding loyalty. Wells was wealthy, reliable, and completely committed to the new regime, an ideal husband for a former York princess. The marriage appears to have been genuinely affectionate. Contemporary letters between Cecily and John reveal warmth and mutual respect rare in political alliances. Cecily adapted well to her new status as a Tudor courtier's wife, supporting her husband's administrative career. John Wells died in 1498, leaving Cecily a wealthy widow at 29. Her period of independence lasted 3 years, during which she managed her late husband's estates competently and maintained cordial relations with the Tudor court. In 1502, Cecily made a controversial second marriage to Thomas Kyme, a Lincolnshire gentleman of modest background. This choice angered Henry VII, who had not been consulted and considered the match beneath her royal birth. The king briefly confiscated her dower lands as punishment. However, Cecily's second marriage proved even happier than her first. Thomas Kyme treated her with devotion, and she bore him 2 daughters, Anne and Margaret Kyme. These children represented the continuation of Edward IV's bloodline through a humble but loving family. After her second marriage, Cecily largely withdrew from court life. She preferred managing her Lincolnshire estates and raising her daughters to the political maneuvering of Henry VIII's emerging court. This retirement may have been voluntary or imposed by royal displeasure. Cecily's daughters married into minor gentry families, carrying York blood into obscure but respectable lineages. Neither achieved prominence, but both lived comfortably and bore children, ensuring their mother's genetic legacy continued. Cecily died in August 1507, during the early years of Henry VIII's reign. Her death passed with little fanfare. She had successfully transformed from York princess to country gentlewoman, avoiding the dangers that had claimed other family members. Her funeral was modest compared to her sister's, reflecting her chosen withdrawal from royal circles. She was buried at Quar Abbey on the Isle of Wight, near her beloved second husband's family lands. Through her daughters, Cecily's bloodline spread through minor English nobility for generations. While none of her descendants achieved great fame, their proliferation meant that Edward IV's genetics permeated the English gentry far more widely than through his more prominent children. This quiet dispersal may have been Cecily's greatest success. By choosing love over status in her second marriage, she ensured her father's bloodline would survive in unexpected places. Tudor persecution could eliminate obvious York claimants, but it could never trace every humble descendant of a forgotten princess. On November 2, 1470, at Westminster Abbey Sanctuary, a prince was born who would become England's most famous missing king. Edward V entered the world while his father fought to reclaim his throne from Henry VI's brief restoration, making the infant heir a symbol of York hopes for the future. His birth location, in sanctuary rather than a royal palace, foreshadowed the precarious nature of his brief reign. Elizabeth Woodville had fled there when Edward IV was temporarily deposed, and her son's first cries echoed through sacred halls that had become a royal refuge. After Edward IV regained his crown in 1471, young Edward was established in his own household at Ludlow Castle on the Welsh border. This strategic placement served multiple purposes. It demonstrated royal authority over Wales, provided the prince with governing experience, and kept him safely distant from London's political intrigues. Under the guidance of his uncle Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers, Edward received the finest education available. His tutors included leading humanist scholars who taught him Latin, Greek, French, and the emerging principles of Renaissance kingship. Contemporary accounts describe him as intelligent and dutiful, showing promise as a future ruler. The prince's household at Ludlow operated as a miniature court, preparing him for royal responsibilities. He held formal audiences, signed documents under supervision, and learned the ceremonial aspects of monarchy. This careful preparation reflected Edward IV's determination that his heir would be ready to rule effectively. Edward IV's unexpected death in April 1483 thrust 12-year-old Edward into the center of England's most enduring mystery. As the new king, he was escorted from Ludlow toward London for his coronation, accompanied by his Woodville relatives and a modest armed force. At Stony Stratford, the royal party encountered Richard, Duke of Gloucester, Edward IV's surviving brother, and the designated Lord Protector. Richard's meeting with his nephew appeared cordial, but he immediately arrested Anthony Woodville and other Woodville supporters, claiming they threatened the realm's stability. Young Edward, now separated from his mother's family, continued toward London under his uncle's protection. Contemporary witnesses noted the boy's dignity despite these troubling circumstances. He seemed to understand that something was wrong, but maintained royal composure, befitting his new status. Upon reaching London, Edward was lodged in the Tower of London's royal apartments, a traditional residence for monarchs before coronation. Initially, this seemed normal protocol. The tower served as both fortress and palace, and previous kings had stayed there during their transition to power. However, Richard's actions soon revealed deeper intentions. He declared Edward's coronation postponed indefinitely, citing the need to investigate alleged irregularities in Edward IV's marriage. These delays created growing unease among supporters who had expected a swift ceremony to confirm the new king's legitimacy. In June 1483, Edward was joined by his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, who was brought from Westminster Sanctuary. The two brothers were seen together in the tower's gardens and at windows, but these sightings became increasingly rare as summer progressed. Richard's coup reached its climax when Parliament declared Edward IV's marriage invalid, making all his children illegitimate. This act, known as Titulus Regius, cleared the succession path for Richard III while simultaneously destroying Edward V's claim to the crown. The young king's response to this legal demolition of his rights remains unknown. Contemporary sources suggest he understood his position had become desperate, but maintained hope that supporters might restore him. No reliable accounts of his thoughts or words during this crucial period survive. Parliament's declaration represented more than legal maneuvering. It marked the moment when Edward V ceased to be king in law, even if he retained the title in many people's minds. His transformation from monarch to prisoner was complete. During the summer of 1483, sightings of both princes in the tower gradually ceased. By autumn, rumors of their deaths were circulating widely, though no bodies were produced and no official announcement was made. The mystery that would captivate historians for centuries had begun. Various theories emerged immediately. Some blamed Richard III directly, arguing he had ordered their execution to secure his throne. Others suggested the boys had been smuggled away for their safety, or that Henry Tudor's agents had eliminated them to prevent future challenges to his own eventual claim. The silence surrounding their fate became its own form of testimony. Had the princes been alive, Richard III would presumably have produced them to counter damaging rumors. Their continued absence spoke louder than any confession. Edward V's brief reign, traditionally dated from April 9th to June 26, 1483, became one of English history's most debated episodes. His disappearance eliminated the direct male line of Edward IV, fundamentally altering the succession and enabling Tudor claims to legitimacy. The mystery also transformed how medieval kingship was understood. Edward V's fate demonstrated that royal blood offered no protection against political calculation, and that even child monarchs could become expendable pawns in dynastic struggles. Recent scholarship has refined understanding of Edward V's situation without solving the central mystery. Archaeological discoveries, including the 1674 finding of child skeletons in the tower, have provided tantalizing but inconclusive evidence about the prince's fate. What remains clear is that Edward V represented the last realistic hope for pure York succession. His disappearance cleared the path for the Tudor dynasty and fundamentally altered English royal lineage. Whether he died as a child or lived hidden elsewhere, his political existence ended in 1483. In April 1472, Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville welcomed another daughter, Margaret of York. Born into the secure years of Edward's second reign, she arrived when the royal nursery was filled with thriving siblings and the kingdom seemed at peace. Margaret's life was tragically brief. She died in December of the same year at just 8 months old. Medieval medicine could offer little explanation for infant mortality, and royal privilege provided no protection against the diseases that claimed young lives with devastating frequency. Her death devastated her parents, particularly her mother, who had already endured the anxieties of bearing royal children during political upheaval. Contemporary accounts describe Elizabeth Woodville's profound grief, as Margaret had been born during a period of renewed hope for the dynasty's future. The infant princess was buried with appropriate ceremony at Westminster Abbey, joining the royal tombs that would later hold many of her siblings. Her brief existence reminds us that even in royal families, not every child lived to shape history. In August 1473, Edward IV's second surviving son entered the world, immediately receiving the ancient title Duke of York. Richard of Shrewsbury's birth secured the succession with a spare heir, relieving pressure on his elder brother Edward and strengthening the York dynasty's future prospects. Named for his uncle Richard of Gloucester, the infant Duke represented hope for continued York rule. His title carried immense historical weight. Duke of York had been Edward IV's own designation before claiming the crown, and it traditionally belonged to the kingdom's second most important prince. Unlike his brother, who was sent to Wales for princely education, Richard remained closer to court during his early years. This proximity to his parents allowed for more direct royal supervision of his upbringing, though he still received education befitting a duke and potential king. Richard's training emphasized military skills alongside academic learning. As Duke of York, he held ceremonial command of northern territories and was expected to understand warfare, governance, and diplomacy. Contemporary accounts describe him as physically robust and quick to learn, showing promise as a future royal brother. His relationship with Edward V appears to have been affectionate. Despite the 4-year age gap, the brothers shared tutors occasionally and participated in court ceremonies together. This bond would prove crucial during their final months together. In 1478, 5-year-old Richard was betrothed to Anne Mowbray, the 8-year-old heiress of the Norfolk dukedom. This marriage alliance brought vast estates into York control, while providing Richard with lands appropriate to his ducal status. The wedding ceremony in 1478 was magnificent, demonstrating Edward IV's wealth and the dynasty's confidence in its future. Richard and Anne were formally married, but would not cohabitate until reaching maturity, following standard practice for child marriages among nobility. Tragically, Anne died in 1481 at just 8 years old, leaving Richard a widower before he truly understood marriage. Her death also created inheritance disputes over the Norfolk estates that would complicate Richard's finances and legal status. When Richard III moved against the Woodville faction in 1483, young Richard initially remained in sanctuary at Westminster with his mother. Elizabeth Woodville had fled there upon hearing of her brother Anthony's arrest, bringing her younger son for protection within sacred walls. However, sanctuary's protection proved inadequate against determined political pressure. Cardinal Bourchier convinced Elizabeth that her son would be safer with his brother in the Tower, arguing that the princes should be together during the coronation preparations. In June 1483, 9-year-old Richard left sanctuary forever, joining Edward V in the Tower's royal apartments. Contemporary witnesses noted his cheerful demeanor. He seemed to view the reunion as an adventure rather than understanding the political trap closing around both brothers. Initial accounts describe both princes playing together in the Tower's gardens, shooting arrows at targets, and enjoying games appropriate to their ages. The younger Richard's presence seemed to comfort his brother, who had been showing signs of anxiety about the delayed coronation. However, their freedom of movement gradually decreased. The boys were seen less frequently at windows and in the gardens. Their servants were reduced in number, and access to visitors became increasingly restricted. The Tower was transforming from palace to prison. The last reliable sighting of Richard occurred in summer 1483, when he was seen with his brother at a Tower window. After this, both princes disappeared from public view entirely, beginning the mystery that would echo through centuries. Richard's youth made his disappearance particularly poignant. At 9 years old, he possessed little understanding of the political forces that had ensnared him. His probable death eliminated not just a life, but also any hope for Edward IV's male line continuation through a younger son. Various pretenders later claimed to be Richard, most notably Perkin Warbeck, who insisted he had escaped the Tower and lived in exile. These claims, while historically dubious, reflected public desire to believe that at least one prince had survived the political catastrophe. Richard's fate became inseparable from his brother's in historical memory. Together, they symbolized innocence destroyed by political ambition, childhood sacrifice to adult power struggles. Their joint disappearance eliminated the strongest York claims and enabled Tudor succession. The Duke of York's story reminds us that royal titles offered no protection to children caught in succession crises. His brief life and mysterious end exemplify how dynastic politics could consume even the youngest participants. In November 1475, another York princess arrived at Westminster Palace. Anne of York entered the world during her father's most secure period, when Edward IV's throne seemed unassailable and the royal nursery overflowed with healthy children representing dynastic continuity. As the fourth surviving daughter, Anne faced different expectations than her elder sisters. While Elizabeth bore the weight of major diplomatic marriages and Mary had been destined for Denmark, Anne's future remained more flexible, allowing her parents to await advantageous opportunities. Anne shared the refined education provided to all Edward's daughters. She excelled particularly in religious studies, showing an early inclination towards spiritual matters that would shape her entire life. Her tutors noted her facility with Latin theological texts and her genuine interest in scriptural interpretation. Unlike some of her sisters who preferred music or languages, Anne gravitated toward contemplative pursuits. She spent hours in the royal chapel, participated eagerly in religious ceremonies, and showed remarkable maturity in discussing spiritual questions with court chaplains. In February 1495, 19-year-old Anne married Thomas Howard, later Earl of Surrey and eventually Duke of Norfolk. This alliance served Henry VII's strategic interests perfectly, binding the powerful Howard family more closely to the Tudor regime while providing Anne with an appropriately noble husband. The marriage represented a significant step up for Anne's status under the new dynasty. The Howards were among England's premier noble families, and Thomas Howard was both wealthy and politically astute. His willingness to marry a former York princess demonstrated his confidence in Tudor permanence. Anne adapted well to her new role as a Howard wife. She managed the family's numerous estates competently and bore Thomas 3 children: Thomas, the future poet Earl of Surrey, Edward, and a daughter who died young. Her household became a center of learning and religious observance. Throughout her marriage, Anne maintained the religious interests that had marked her youth. She founded several chantries, supported monastic houses, and became known for her charitable work among the poor. These activities reflected genuine piety rather than mere noble obligation. Anne's spiritual devotion intensified after the death of her infant daughter. She began wearing a hair shirt beneath her court dress and spent increasing time in prayer and contemplation. Some contemporaries worried that grief was driving her toward excessive religious observance. Her husband Thomas supported her spiritual pursuits while ensuring she fulfilled her social obligations. The Howards maintained a prominent position at Henry VIII's court, and Anne's presence at ceremonies and celebrations was expected despite her preference for quieter activities. Thomas Howard's death in 1524 left Anne a widow at 48. Rather than remarrying, she chose to deepen her religious commitments, effectively retiring from court life to focus on spiritual matters and charitable works. Anne's widowhood coincided with the early years of Henry VIII's marriage difficulties and the beginning of religious upheaval in England. Her traditional Catholic devotion put her at odds with the king's emerging break from Rome, though she avoided direct political involvement. She spent her final years managing her dower estates and supporting religious causes that aligned with her conservative faith. Her household became a refuge for scholars and clerics who shared her resistance to religious innovation. Anne died in November 1511 at Greenwich Palace, surrounded by her surviving children and grandchildren. Her death was mourned by both the Howard family and the many religious communities she had supported throughout her life. She was buried beside her husband at Bedford Priory, with a tomb that emphasized her piety and charitable works. The inscription praised her as a model of noble womanhood who had used her position to serve God and aid the poor. Through her children, Anne's bloodline merged with one of England's most powerful noble families. Her son Thomas became a renowned poet and military commander, while her grandson Thomas Howard would become Duke of Norfolk and a central figure in Henry VIII's later reign. Anne's legacy lay not in political maneuvering, but in demonstrating how royal birth could be channeled towards spiritual and charitable purposes. Her life showed that Edward IV's daughters could find meaning beyond dynastic politics. In March 1477, Edward IV welcomed his third son, immediately granting him the prestigious title Duke of Bedford. George's birth seemed to confirm the dynasty's strength. 3 healthy sons provided abundant security for the succession, with each prince representing different aspects of royal power. The infant duke's title carried significant political weight. Bedford had traditionally been held by members of the royal family who governed key territories, and little George's designation suggested his parents' confidence in long-term York rule. However, George's life proved tragically brief. He died in March 1479, at just 2 years old, becoming another victim of the infant mortality that claimed so many medieval children regardless of their royal status. His death devastated Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, who had seen in their third son additional insurance for their dynasty's future. George was buried with appropriate ceremony at Windsor Castle. his tiny tomb a reminder of how quickly royal hopes could be shattered. The Duke of Bedford's death left Edward V and Richard as the only surviving sons, a reduction that would prove catastrophic when political crisis struck the family just 4 years later. In August 1479, Catherine of York entered a world that was beginning to show cracks in the Yorkist facade. Born just months after her infant brother George's death, she arrived as her parents were still grieving and the kingdom faced new challenges to Edward IV's rule. As the fifth surviving daughter, Catherine's birth was welcomed but carried less dynastic significance than earlier children. By this point, her parents understood that daughters, while valuable for marriage alliances, could not provide the same succession security as sons. Catherine's education followed the established pattern for York princesses. She learned French, Latin, and the arts of noble womanhood, but her childhood was marked by increasing political tension as her father faced challenges to his authority. The young princess showed particular aptitude for languages and diplomacy, skills that would serve her well in later life. Her tutors noted her ability to charm visitors and her precocious understanding of courtly protocol. Unlike her elder sisters, Catherine's childhood was shadowed by the family's mounting troubles. She witnessed her parents' growing anxiety about succession and security, experiences that taught her early lessons about political vulnerability. Catherine was only 3 years old when her father died and her uncle Richard III seized power. The constitutional crisis that followed transformed her from princess to bastard overnight, as Parliament declared all Edward IV's children illegitimate. During the tumultuous months of 1483, Catherine remained with her mother in Westminster Sanctuary. The experience of watching armed men guard sanctuary doors and sensing her mother's terror left deep impressions on the young child. When her brothers disappeared into the tower and her uncle claimed the crown, Catherine's world collapsed entirely. From a secure royal childhood, she faced an uncertain future as a dispossessed bastard with no legal standing. Henry VII's victory at Bosworth brought new hope for Catherine's future. The Tudor king's policy of reconciliation with York survivors meant that Edward IV's daughters could be rehabilitated and used to strengthen the new dynasty's legitimacy. In 1495, 19-year-old Catherine married William Courtenay, Earl of Devon, in a ceremony that demonstrated Henry VII's commitment to healing dynastic wounds. The Courtenays were an ancient noble family with their own royal connections, making them suitable allies for former York princesses. The marriage proved harmonious and productive. Catherine bore William 3 children, Henry, Edward, and Margaret Courtenay. These offspring carried Edward IV's bloodline into another noble house, continuing the genetic dispersal that characterized all his daughters' stories. As Countess of Devon, Catherine found happiness managing the Courtenay estates in the southwestern counties. The West Country's relative isolation from London politics allowed her to build a stable life away from court intrigue and succession disputes. Catherine proved an able administrator of the family's vast holdings. She oversaw improvements to Courtenay castles, supported local religious institutions, and became a respected figure among Devon's gentry families. Her household became a center of learning and culture, continuing the intellectual traditions she had inherited from Edward IV's court. Catherine patronized scholars and artists, ensuring that York cultural values survived in Devonshire society. William Courtenay's death in 1511 left Catherine a widow with adult children, but still many years of life ahead. Rather than remarrying, she chose to focus on managing the family inheritance and ensuring her children's successful integration into Tudor society. Catherine's later years were marked by increasing religious devotion. Following a pattern common among her sisters, she supported monastic reform movements and became known for her charitable works among Devon's poor communities. She maintained cordial relations with the Tudor court while avoiding deep involvement in its politics. This careful balance allowed her to preserve her family's status while staying clear of the dangerous factional struggles that characterized Henry VIII's reign. Catherine died at Colcombe Castle in November 1527, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. Her funeral was attended by much of Devon's nobility, reflecting the respect she had earned through decades of capable local leadership. She was buried at Colcombe Parish Church, her tomb emphasizing her role as Countess of Devon rather than her York royal birth. This choice reflected her successful transformation from displaced princess to respected regional matriarch. Through her children, Catherine's bloodline became firmly embedded in West Country nobility. The Courtenays remained important figures in Devon politics for generations, carrying Edward IV's genetics into one of England's most distinctive regional cultures. Catherine's story demonstrates how Edward IV's daughters successfully adapted to reduced circumstances while maintaining their dignity and influence. Her West Country legacy showed that royal blood could flourish even far from London's palaces. In November 1480, the last of Edward IV's children arrived at Eltham Palace. Bridget of York was born into a family already showing signs of strain. Her elder siblings faced uncertain futures, and political pressures were mounting against her father's reign. As the youngest daughter, Bridget experienced the most disrupted childhood of all Edward's children. She was barely 2 years old when her father died, and her uncle Richard III seized power, making her too young to understand the constitutional crisis that destroyed her legitimacy. The sanctuary months at Westminster profoundly shaped young Bridget's worldview. Surrounded by religious ritual and sustained by clerical charity, she absorbed lessons about spiritual refuge that would influence her entire life. Unlike her sisters who adapted to marriage and secular noble life, Bridget showed early signs of religious calling. Even as a child, she preferred prayer to play and showed unusual interest in monastic routines and spiritual discipline. Henry VII's court recognized and encouraged these inclinations. A royal daughter entering religious life served multiple political purposes. It demonstrated Tudor piety, removed a potential focus for York loyalist sentiment, and provided a respectable alternative to problematic marriages. In 1492, 11-year-old Bridget entered Dartford Priory as a novice nun. This Dominican house was considered appropriate for royal daughters, offering comfortable living conditions while maintaining strict religious observance. Bridget's entry was accompanied by generous endowments from Henry VII, demonstrating royal support for her choice. The king's patronage ensured that she would live comfortably while pursuing her spiritual vocation away from political complications. Bridget embraced monastic life with genuine enthusiasm. She excelled in her religious studies, became fluent in theological Latin, and developed a reputation for deep spiritual insight despite her youth. Her presence at Dartford attracted other noble daughters seeking religious life, and the priory experienced a cultural renaissance under royal patronage. Bridget's influence helped maintain high educational standards and attracted learned visitors. Bridget spent over 40 years at Dartford, becoming one of the community's most respected members. She served in various administrative roles and became known for her wisdom in spiritual matters. Her death in 1517 marked the end of Edward IV's direct line. As the last surviving child of the York king, her passing symbolically closed a chapter in English royal history that had begun with such promise in the 1460s. Bridget's life demonstrated that royal daughters could find fulfillment outside marriage and politics. Her choice of religious life over worldly advancement reflected values that transcended dynastic ambition, offering an alternative model of noble womanhood that emphasized spiritual rather than political achievement. Among the legitimate heirs of Edward IV stood one acknowledged illegitimate son, Arthur Plantagenet, born around 1472 to an unknown mother. Unlike his half-siblings, Arthur's existence depended entirely on his father's recognition and favor, making his survival and success remarkable. Edward IV's acknowledgement of Arthur reflected the king's confidence and generosity. Rather than hiding his illegitimate son, the king provided him with education, status, and opportunities, demonstrating the flexible approach to royal bastards that characterized medieval monarchy. Arthur's exact mother remains historically uncertain, though contemporary records suggest she was a woman of gentle birth rather than a common mistress. This ambiguity about his maternal lineage would later complicate his position, but never undermined his Plantagenet identity. As an acknowledged royal bastard, Arthur received education befitting his status. He was trained in warfare, administration, and diplomacy, preparing him for the kind of supporting role that illegitimate royal sons often played in medieval government. His relationship with his legitimate half-siblings appears to have been affectionate. Contemporary accounts suggest Elizabeth of York maintained cordial relations with her half-brother throughout their lives, and Arthur showed consistent loyalty to his father's memory and his siblings' interests. Arthur's illegitimate status paradoxically protected him during the succession crises that destroyed his legitimate brothers. Henry VII saw no threat in Edward IV's bastard son and instead recognized his potential value as a supporter who could help legitimize Tudor rule. The new regime offered Arthur opportunities for advancement that legitimate York heirs could never have enjoyed. His loyalty to the Tudors was both pragmatic and genuine. He understood that his survival depended on serving the new dynasty faithfully. Arthur's fortunes transformed dramatically when he married Elizabeth Grey, daughter of Edward Grey, 1st Viscount Lisle. This marriage brought him the Lisle Viscountcy and substantial estates, elevating him from royal bastard to substantial nobleman. As Viscount Lisle, Arthur found his proper sphere of influence. He served competently in various administrative roles, demonstrating the military and political skills his education had provided. His success vindicated Edward IV's decision to acknowledge and support his illegitimate son. Arthur's greatest opportunity came when Henry VIII appointed him Deputy of Calais, one of the most important military and administrative positions in the Tudor government. This role demonstrated the complete integration of Edward IV's bastard into the new dynasty service. The Calais position suited Arthur perfectly. His military skills, diplomatic experience, and understanding of continental politics made him an effective governor of England's last French possession. His correspondence from this period reveals a competent, loyal administrator. Arthur's tenure at Calais produced one of the 16th century's most valuable historical sources, the Lisle Letters. This extensive correspondence between Arthur, his wife, and their contacts across Europe provides unparalleled insight into Tudor governance and society. The letters reveal Arthur as a devoted family man, careful administrator, and shrewd political observer. His illegitimate birth never prevented him from building successful relationships across the social spectrum, from merchants to monarchs. Arthur's career ended tragically in 1540 when he was arrested on charges of treasonous correspondence with Cardinal Pole and other Catholic exiles. These accusations, probably fabricated, reflected Henry VIII's growing paranoia about Catholic plotting against his religious policies. He died in the Tower of London in 1542, reportedly of shock upon learning of his reprieve. The royal pardon arrived too late to save him from the stress that killed him. His death eliminated the last active male representative of Edward IV's bloodline. Arthur's life story demonstrates how illegitimate royal children could thrive through adaptability and service. His success under both Henry VII and Henry VIII showed that loyal competence could overcome the disadvantage of bastard birth. The Lisle Letters ensure that Arthur's legacy extends far beyond his own lifetime. Through his correspondence, modern historians can understand Tudor society with a depth and intimacy that no other source provides, making Edward IV's bastard son an invaluable window into his era. In less than 50 years, the 10 children of Edward IV shaped the turning of England from Plantagenet to Tudor. Some built new dynasties, others vanished into legend or cloister. Their lives remind us that the end of a royal house is never sudden. It fades through marriages, faith, and memory. Elizabeth's womb united the Roses and bore the Tudor line. Mary's early death eliminated Danish alliance possibilities. Cecily found love in Lincolnshire obscurity. Edward and Richard disappeared into mystery that still captivates historians. Anne embraced spiritual life among the Howards. Catherine built influence in Devon's Hills. Bridget chose God over worldly power. Arthur proved that bastards could serve new dynasties loyally. Together, their stories reveal how royal bloodlines disperse and transform rather than simply ending. Edward IV's genetics spread through noble families across England, from Howard palaces to Courtenay castles to unnamed gentry households where York descendants lived quietly for generations. The Tower still holds its secrets about the lost princes. Westminster Abbey preserves their sisters' tombs. Dartford Priory's ruins mark Bridget's spiritual refuge. The Lisle Letters preserve Arthur's voice across centuries. These traces remind us that even fallen dynasties leave lasting marks on the kingdoms they once ruled. From the Tower of London to Westminster's vaults, traces of Edward IV's line remain, half hidden in brass, stone, and bloodlines that still touch Britain's throne today. The White Rose of York never truly died. It simply took root in unexpected soil, growing quietly through the centuries that followed.